Palestine was the British Empire's most dramatic failure. In the beginning, the British promised the Jewish people a home in an Arab country, a promise that led to hatred and bloodshed. Britain's undignified departure left the Palestinian people dispossessed and a Jewish state to fight for its life. Jerusalem, 1946. The King David Hotel, British government headquarters, dominates a country of 1 million Arabs and 500,000 Jews. The Jews are determined to kick the British out and achieve the Zionist goal, a state of their own. They blow up the building. For 2,000 years, Jews worldwide have prayed, "Next year in Jerusalem, we shall return to Zion." Now Zionist shock troops of the Irgun Zvi Leumi take matters into their own hands. 91 die, British, Arab, and Jew.
I don't accept there was any brutality in anything we did. We were fighting a war. And a war involves, of course, force, and it's not good, it's not nice. We should have preferred not to have it. But brutality as such, for the sake of brutality, I don't believe anybody could accuse us of that.
We were hoping that Britain will help us save Palestine. Will help us save Palestine. All we wanted to Britain get out of Palestine and let us take it over and let democratic rule prevail there, which recognizes the rights of everybody living in Palestine.
My feeling was that we had a task to try to guide a country and its people towards a prosperous and happy future. And here were one side of the equation who were using what we regarded, or what I regarded anyhow, as pretty unscrupulous means to pressurize us through world opinion. Now, I mentioned that the Zionist cause in Palestine had a wider support in world opinion than any other colonial cause has ever had.
Zionism was born in Europe in the late 19th century, a Jewish dream of freedom from persecution in the biblical land of milk and honey. But to settle in a country inhabited by Arabs, the Jews needed protection. The British were to provide it. The British Army captured the Holy Land in the First World War, driving the Turks from the Middle East. Britain had a vision of a great new imperial domain stretching from India to Egypt. The victorious powers carved new states out of the desert, appointing their rulers. The British wanted Palestine as a military base to protect the vital artery of the empire, the Suez Canal. For this, they needed international approval. The Zionists tipped the balance.
The Zionists were the people who were lobbying all over the world in the Versailles Peace Conference and everywhere else to see that Britain did get this charge, so that there was a contract here. We would help Britain become the ruling power, and Britain would help us to develop the Jewish national home.
الإنجليز دخلت بلادنا سنة 17 وأنا كان عمري 7 سنين وحضرت تركيا وما كان في البلاد شيء إلا يهود وعرب مثل الإخوة وما في بيننا شيء اللي ينعد حرابة لكن الإنجليز استعماري كان يجيب بالألوف من الهجرة من اليهود ويحط في البلاد وحتى عمر وخلاهم يشتروا الأرض ويعملوا كل شيء ودخلت في الجيش 10 سنين وعارف السياسة تبعهم.
The Jewish settlers arrived from Europe to be looked after by their own administration, the Jewish Agency. They brought with them Western ways and money to buy up land. Thousands of Palestinian peasants were evicted, and in the towns many of the new jobs were for Jews only. In the 1930s, Palestinians took up arms against a colonial government that they believed was robbing them of the prospect of independence in their own country.
These pictures from Patty's own cameraman in the East show the height of the danger in Jerusalem when arson, murder and wanton destruction were making the Holy Land a land of terror. But behind the outward peace lies still the threat of rebellion and disorder. Britain still stands by.
The British responded ruthlessly, but it took them 3 years to crush the uprising. Palestinian leaders were exiled, their movement disarmed. Hitler's defeat in the Second World War revealed the unbelievable. Auschwitz and the annihilation by the Nazis of some 25 million people. 6 million were Jews. The Holocaust was to break the back of Britain's Palestine policy. It won the Jews worldwide sympathy and the Zionists support in their demand for a Jewish state.
They can smile now, these people who a few short weeks ago thought they would never smile again. Then the entire camp is scorched off the face of the earth by British flamethrowers. The fires blot out the place, but not the memory.
Well, I was in Auschwitz when I realized that the only solution, or rather the only hope of survival for the Jews, for us Jews, would be a state of our own, a country where we could live and work, a country that could protect us. Of course, I didn't really believe that I would survive Auschwitz. But should I survive, I decided I would be a very dedicated Zionist.
From Britain and America, the Holocaust refugees got sympathy, but no offers of sanctuary. Undismayed, the Zionists called for them to be admitted to Palestine. They saw immigration as the key to a Jewish state, though they needed the new British Labour government to unlock the door. For Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, the request posed a dilemma. Jewish immigration to Palestine had been restricted before the war, and they were reluctant to lift the quotas.
Bevin's view was that one of the reasons we had fought the war was Nazi anti-Semitism. And one of the consequences of the war ought to be the possibility of Jews living normal lives in Europe again. He said this in public several times. Why now that Nazism has been destroyed, should the Jews not again contribute to the cultural and economic life of Europe as they did before? Bevin suggested after World War II that the Jews should not worry so much about Palestine. We should help to rebuild Europe on the smoking ruins of our families. That's what he suggested. That was the humanity which was shown to us by Mr. Bevin.
Of course, only Bevin saw very clearly that if we were to have Palestine flooded by Jews, whatever the humanitarian reasons, this was going to cause immense trouble, not only with the Arabs of Palestine, but also with the whole Islamic world and the Arab countries, with whom he also wanted to establish a new relationship which would not be the old relationship of protectorates and empire and all the rest of it.
The Arab rulers of the Middle East were now seen as pillars of the empire. British oil supplies, strategic routes, bases like Palestine, and defense against communism all depended on good relations with the Arab states. But the Arab League were vocal opponents of Jewish immigration to Palestine. They feared the Zionists' intentions, as did the Palestinians.
The problem is who have to suffer for the Jewish immigration. Why do they insist to come only to Palestine? Why? It's a political thing. It's far from humanitarian. to be humanitarian.
They had Britain to go to, they had the United States, they had all European countries. Why should we be victimized by the victims of the Nazis? Why should they come to our country?
Palestine was inhabited by Arabs, and we didn't want the Arabs to be displaced or deprived of their homeland or of their right to self-determination, like the people of Lebanon, of Jordan, of Iraq, of all the rest of the Arab world.
Though Palestinians still outnumbered Jews by 2 to 1, they had no say in the government and had no influence on British public opinion. Palestinian communities in towns and villages, along with their cause, were either ignored by the Western camera or portrayed in biblical cliches. The traditional way of life of the Arabs was contrasted with an image of industrious and progressive Jews who'd concentrated their efforts in the fertile coastal areas. They built up a Western-style economy, drawing on powerful international support. They also had an underground army, 50,000 strong, the Haganah. By 1946, the Zionists were using all these resources to defy Britain's immigration quotas.
I joined the Bricha. Bricha means escape, which was a division of the Haganah, of the Jewish underground movement. And in fact, my job was to smuggle people from the German border into Belgium or into France directly, or from Belgium into France. Most of the DP, the displaced person camps, were in the British zone, and they wanted to stop the Jews from going to Palestine, and they realized that the Haganah was in fact taking them to Palestine.
Newsreels followed as thousands of refugees were shipped to Palestine. Most of the boats were arrested by the British Navy and escorted into Haifa. British soldiers sent the so-called illegals to detention camps. Britain was charged with inhumanity.
A great many were persuaded that they should go to Palestine. And I think they're probably conned into it in many ways because the Zionists wished to use them as instruments in securing their objectives. We felt that if we had simply, out of a great surge of humanitarianism, said, oh, you poor people, you better come in, it was going to fracture our entire policy, and we had to, well, harden our hearts a bit and turn them back, a lot of them to Cyprus.
Onto that British vessel, Zionists are transferred from a small Jewish refugee ship to be deported to Cyprus, and some try to resist. So near to Zion, and now to be taken away. Removed from their tiny craft, they leave what has been an ordeal of evil conditions, unsanitary overcrowding and thirst. But to them, internment on Cyprus is just another exile, and they have to be forced.
Bevin wanted no more refugees in Palestine than the Arabs would agree to. But the Zionists demanded entry for 100,000 and had won the backing of the American president, Harry Truman. He controlled the aid that war-scarred Britain desperately needed.
I remember in Bevin's absence once, I had to receive the American ambassador. And he said he had a message from the president for the Secretary of State. The president wished to repeat his urgent and earnest request to admit immediately 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. And I said that, according to my brief, I said that the Secretary of State's view was that this was simply a recipe for war. Well, the ambassador had expected this, and he simply said, very deliberately, the fact is that the president believes that if Mr. Bevin can accede to his request, that would help Britain's friends in Congress to get through the latest appropriation of British aid, which is how a diplomat says, I mean, there was bread rationing in Britain at that time, that's how a diplomat says, you do what we want or you'll go hungry.
And back here in Washington, domestic reflections of Palestine's days of crisis. President Truman meets with members of the Jewish war veterans, here to press demands for immediate admission of 100,000 refugees.
America had the largest Jewish community in the world. For Truman, their votes were vital. Influential Zionists had regular access to the White House, and some contributed generously to Truman's campaign funds.
President Truman's attitude toward Palestine was made up of mixed motives. He had been deeply horrified by the full scope of the Holocaust when we got into Eastern Europe and found out what that meant. He, of course, was heavily involved with Jewish people in the United States who were in support of Palestine from a political point of view.
Before every election, the influence of the Zionists reached a peak. In the summer of 1946, they urged Truman to call for partition, to create an independent Jewish state in a divided Palestine. White House aides persuaded Truman to support the Zionists' new demand.
As time went on, he concluded that the British were not going to solve the problem. He felt that there was substantial vacillation on the part of the British, and he came to the conclusion that if there was ever to be a Jewish homeland, which he desired greatly, it would have to be accomplished through partition.
Attlee and Bevin believed they were winning American support for a policy acceptable to the Arabs. The telegram from Truman telling them the opposite reached Attlee in Paris.
The telegram was brought to us, I think, in the middle of the night or early in the morning, anyhow, before breakfast. And we read it, and I took it to Attlee, who was having breakfast in bed. And he read the telegram through and said, handed it back to me. He said, "I'll send him a stinker. Go and draft it."
It made no difference to President Truman, though, whether they were upset or whether they weren't upset. He had a goal, and he was determined to achieve it.
In Palestine itself, the Zionists had turned to more direct methods. The campaign was led in secret by David Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Jewish Agency, official advisors to the colonial government. Now they linked up with Menachem Begin, leader of the Irgun, and other extremists. This Irgun film helped raise money in America for secret shipments of arms.
We are no longer content with words alone. Only thus shall we win our freedom. We have heard the speeches and tried every means. Now we fight. I and my fellow fighters in the Hebrew resistance are answering British guns with Hebrew guns.
We did, of course, have an enormous amount of covered information about the organization of Jewish terrorism and the supply of arms, equipment, and so on to the Jewish terrorists. The Jewish Agency always denied that they were the policy makers in regard to acts of terrorism, but we knew a bit better than that.
The British wanted to prove the Jewish Agency's complicity in terrorism. In June 1946, troops arrested its leaders, rounded up some 3,000 people, and raided the kibbutzim, the suspected arsenals of the underground army, the Haganah.
Our infrastructure were the kibbutzim. The kibbutzim, like the kibbutz that we are just now, the kibbutzim was a place where we could pass for just civilians. We were working there for 15 days every month in order to make our living, and 15 days we were trained. And in every kibbutz, we have a store, underground store for arms.
One of the unit, in fact, who were searching an outhouse and toilet, he had occasion, in fact, to use the toilet, and was quite surprised that once having pulled the chain and levered the seat in a particular direction, he started, in fact, to rise on his seat. And this revealed a tunnel beneath, which led to an arms cache which contained something in excess of 500 rifles and about 3,000 grenades. And he was a very surprised man.
Arms caches revealed an extensive network of military preparations. Ironically, it was the British who had first armed and trained Jewish settlers. Now, the guns were turned on their instructors, but the British were determined to keep their Palestine base.
This is Jerusalem, a name in every day's headline news. Pathé takes you into this city to show you where and how the British soldier is carrying out the dirtiest, most dangerous and most thankless job in the world today. For him, Jerusalem has no glamour, no mystery and no rewards. Only hard work and constant nerve-breaking suspense. Barbed wire, a people sullen and hostile. While Arab and Jew have a cause to battle for, the British soldier is there only because it is his job to keep the peace. That is the British Tommy's life in Palestine today. We salute him.
Our armed forces were very strong in the Middle East. There was the base in Egypt and also a lot of troops in Palestine, mainly used, of course, in dealing with Jewish and Arab malcontents, but still also a military base. And so there was no question of our just disappearing, as it were, rapidly. He was thinking in terms of a settlement, I think, which would have been acceptable to both Jews and Arabs, and which would have given us certain rights.
Meanwhile, the Zionists pressed ahead, building new kibbutzim in strategic areas, the military foundation of a Jewish state. Their partition scheme would give them less land than they wanted, but still a stronghold in which Jews could settle freely. Faced with the overwhelming energy of the Zionists, a Palestinian leader appealed to the British.
All we ask is to have the natural right of all nations, independence. We seek the setting up of a democratic government in which all genuine citizens will have the same rights and the same obligations.
Although the Arab League backed the Palestinian demand, Britain rejected it. But the Arabs still relied on Britain to withstand Zionist pressure.
Compared with the Zionists, they were separated by the totally different culture and procedures and politics of their countries and ours. I mean, if they did make some kind of submission in writing, it would be wrongly worded, the arguments would be wrong, it would be sent to the wrong person. Whereas, of course, the Zionist lobby was right in among British politics, and there were Zionists so close to the cabinet that there have been instances where cabinet ministers actually telephoned the result of a cabinet meeting straight to the Zionist concern.
Well, the fact is that the Arab states had never accurately estimated nor realized the power of Zionism. And they thought the Zionists were just a few Jews who were in Palestine and a few Jews who we know in Iraq and around. They didn't realize the power of Zionism in the United States, nor the influence of Zionism on the United States government.
At the end of 1946, Bevin went to America, knowing that many British cabinet ministers supported the Zionist plan for partition of Palestine. But in his talks with the Americans, he remained adamant that Britain would not risk antagonizing the Arabs. Bevin devised a new way out of the dilemma. Winning the cabinet over, he asked the United Nations to advise Britain on a solution.
We were ambivalent. On the one hand, we wanted to get out of Mr. Bevin's clutches. On the other hand, when he said, "I'll put it to the United Nations," he said this in a rather threatening voice. "You think I'm bad? All right, I'm going to suggest somebody who will hit you even harder, and you'll get nothing out of the UN at all."
Oh, we thought the United Nations were quite optimistic. We thought the United Nations would really act by the spirit of the Charter. And the spirit of the Charter certainly would have protected the rights of the Palestinians, the inhabitants of the country. But, of course, what happened was the cart was turned over by Truman.
From Palestine, first pictures of the latest bomb outrage. Jewish terrorists blow up the Goldsmith Officers Club in Jerusalem. 13 Britons were killed and 16 injured. Says Palestine Commander-in-Chief General Macmillan, the men responsible for these killings are not terrorists. They're just plain thugs and murderers.
Is he still alive, General Macmillan?
Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, you could call us anything. Of course he accused us of being, but I could say the same about him.
Of course, I have tremendous sympathy, as all the British people did have for the Jews for their persecution by Hitler. But that didn't detract from the fact that to get them settled in Palestine so that they did have a proper home had to be done in an orderly and constitutional manner, and not by murders.
The army decided to try on the Jews some of the methods familiar to the Palestinians from their rebellion. They stepped up death sentences on terrorists and imposed martial law on Jewish communities in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It was a collective punishment: no work, no shops, no services, and strict curfews.
The martial law period was a much more active one from our point of view than any other period had been. We carried out 63 operations in the 16 days of martial law, because we had prepared, as I said, we planned it in a sense. We provoked it. And I remember the general in charge of the operation had a press conference every morning in the hotel, and he said, we've got them bottled up. You can see they're surrounded on three sides. On land and sea, you can see our boats patrolling the coast. And this went on for 16 days, and then martial law just collapsed.
Our hands were very considerably tied. Had the army been allowed, in fact, to act as an army, I feel we could have contained particular situations. It just got out of hand to us being, frankly, too gentlemanly. We had to be seen to be acting in the right way.
4,000 miles away at the United Nations, the Zionists were winning support, contrary to British forecasts. In June 1947, a special committee, known as UNSCOP, was sent on a fact-finding tour. To the Arabs, this was yet another inquiry dominated by America, which had no right to pronounce on their future. Palestinian leaders boycotted its hearings. In contrast, the Jewish agency set out to impress.
We appointed two liaison officers, Horowitz, who was later our leading economist and banker, and myself, to accompany the commission and, as it were, illuminate the whole Zionist picture from their point of view. And therefore it was part of my job to see that they learnt as much about our point of view as possible.
The Zionist lesson was driven home by the legendary Exodus affair. It proved a powerful publicity coup.
With a cargo of 4,500 refugees, the Exodus is the largest ship ever to attempt to run the watchful British naval blockade. After a bloody battle with a British boarding party, the refugees disembark at Haifa. Some are dying. 20 others are in a serious condition. And as the tired and weary refugees are transferred to British prison ships, two members of the United Nations Committee on Palestine silently look on.
They actually went on board, some members of the UN Commission, and they saw the hose pipes and the tear gas being turned on these very wretched-looking people who had escaped from concentration camps in Germany. It was apparently such a squalid spectacle that the first thing that the UNSCOP decided was not partition or against partition, but the mandate has to end.
With the tide running against him, Bevin decided to make an example of the Exodus refugees. He sent them back where they had come from, to Germany and the refugee camps. For Bevin, it was a propaganda disaster. But Britain was in a tough mood. In Palestine, they hanged 3 more Irgun terrorists. Menachem Begin hit back. The Irgun kidnapped and hanged 2 British sergeants. They left their bodies booby-trapped for when the British found them.
All decent people must have been horrified by the murder by Jewish terrorists of the 2 British sergeants, Mervyn Pace and Clifford Martin. Until the appalling situation in Palestine is cleared up, unspeakable outrages may well continue.
With the burial of the sergeants went British hopes for a future in Palestine. Parliament and the public demanded the withdrawal of British troops.
I'm speaking
writing on behalf of my mother, Mrs. Martin, who is broken-hearted and prostrate at the terrible news of the loss of her son. And let us hope that we can find a solution to this terrible problem in Palestine and bring an end to all this unnecessary murdering of young British innocent servicemen.
Obviously, it was becoming increasingly difficult for the armed forces to maintain law and order. Especially at that time, it was the Jews, who were obviously producing an extremely effective underground movement. And Bevin would have liked to deal with it, but it wasn't possible.
We were under very strong political pressure from the Foreign Office because they were looking at the wider national relations, for example, with the United States and also with the Arab world, and they were doing a careful balancing act, which often amounts to, well, anything you do will be difficult and dangerous, so let's do very little.
By the autumn of 1947, the cabinet had to make a decision. Economic crisis had forced Attlee once again to go cap in hand to America. The UN Special Committee had recommended that the British should go, leaving Palestine partitioned into a Jewish and an Arab state. Bevin said partition would mean war, and warned the UN that Britain would have no part in it. But at the General Assembly in November, the Zionists and the Americans used strong-arm tactics to win votes.
We were working very hard under the direct personal instruction of President Truman to get a successful vote on that. We used all the persuasion we could with delegates in New York. We went to many capitals bilaterally to try to get their governments to be sure that they had the instructions to work with us on this matter.
So in the meantime, pressure was brought on the states, on the capitals, and telephones from the Zionists and from Truman to the capitals, to heads of states, commands came to the members to change their votes. And some of them, like Romulo, had to run away because he was threatened by the Zionists. Haiti's representative began to cry when he was forced to change his vote. Belt of Cuba resigned as ambassador to Washington until he resigned rather than vote for partition. So Cuba appointed somebody else to vote for partition. The cleanliness of the case was destroyed. It was no more a clean business. You are British, you appreciate sportsmanship and being a clean game. It was no more a clean game. And I said that in the United Nations in 1947. I said the United Nations General Assembly has no jurisdiction and no right to partition a country against the wishes of the inhabitants.
The vote to partition Palestine would in the event mean war, for the Palestinians to defend their country, for the Jews to win a state.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting, and bloodshed.
As Jews retaliated and the chaos spread, so began the most extraordinary 6 months of British colonial rule anywhere. Britain announced it would quit, in its own good time. Meanwhile, the British would do nothing but protect their own backs while the slow process of evacuation began. They would not maintain law and order, nor would they implement the United Nations plan to set up a Jewish and an Arab state. Nor would they let in the UN officials to do so themselves. For Bevin, this was the only honorable course.
We said, all right, the United Nations has a plan. We're not going to oppose it, but we don't think it'll work. It'll cause too much trouble with Arabs and Jews, and we are not going to take responsibility of executing it.
If we tried to impose partition, we would at once alienate the Arabs and probably start a war with them. The Arabs would then possibly gravitate to be friends with the Russians, and we would be involved in a futile war fighting Arabs who were our friends on behalf of the Jews who you could hardly say were our friends at the time.
At the United Nations, the colonial secretary brushed aside the protests.
British public opinion will permit no more expenditure of life and treasure. It will acquiesce no longer in the use of British forces and the squandering of British lives to impose a policy in Palestine which one or other of the parties is determined to resist.
We had a feeling at that time that, I would say, to give them the benefit of the doubt, that they didn't care damn what's going to happen, and if the Arabs will conquer the Arab Legion, all right, let them.
That doesn't interfere at all, the British administration. Never interferes in that. It's not their business. It's finished. You Jews and Arabs, deal with yourselves. Do what you want.
In the growing anarchy, the UN partition plan didn't stand a chance. The proposed Jewish state would contain hundreds of thousands of Arabs. The area allocated to the Palestinians was claimed by many Zionists as theirs by right. Both sides claimed Jerusalem as their sacred city and rejected the plan to make it international. In the vacuum created by the British, the issue was to be settled by the gun. Jewish forces were well prepared. They now trained openly for war. They'd set up a government for Jewish areas. The commanders saw no reason to keep within the UN boundaries. The Arabs, after all, had rejected them first.
They made their major mistake. If they would have accepted at that time the resolution, the Jewish state would have been perhaps as based on the United Nations resolution based on the partition. Once they broke the rules of the game, then there was no game.
We were fighting to live. We were fighting to stay in our houses. We know that the Zionist aims is to shift us all, to exert us all from all Palestine. We want to stay in our homes. Therefore, we fight for our children, for our land.
No one was well trained. The Jews were well trained because they knew what they were planning for. But we did not know what we were planning for because of our beloved leaders at that time.
The Palestinian leaders had been in exile and military activity suppressed. Now, villagers and groups of irregulars began training themselves, acquiring weapons where they could.
The best way to prevent the Zionists from attacking our villages is to try to cut their communications. Therefore, we attacked the convoys, and believe me, all the convoys we attacked were in armored cars, buses and trucks, and they were all armored cars from the steel the British troops provided for the Jews.
It was the convoys supplying the Jews in Jerusalem that the Palestinians hit the hardest. There were many casualties. The wrecks have since been made into monuments.
We blame the British for not keeping law and order that was their role until the final evacuation of Palestine, and especially keeping alive the road to Jerusalem, keeping free the road to Jerusalem. On the other side, they were really blessed not to intervene, and we were happy about that because it let us rather overcome the Arabs and do whatever we wanted in order to help Jerusalem to survive.
With the British keeping their distance, the Haganah defeated the Palestinian irregulars here at El Castel, dominating the Jerusalem road. It was part of a military offensive to secure the Jewish state. Gaining territory, preferably without its Arab inhabitants, was a welcome byproduct for the Jewish agency. For the Irgun, with whom they had an alliance, it was the main aim.
We had a plan that while we couldn't force the Jewish agency to go back on its agreement to the partition scheme, we as dissidents, and we didn't mind what they called us, thugs or terrorists or whatever, would go beyond these boundaries, win the battles as we hoped, and then hand over the territory as such to the Haganah to look after.
Jerusalem was one area in which there was a cooperation between the Irgun and the Haganah, and the commander of Jerusalem was giving latitude that according to the interest and according to his forces to cooperate with the Irgun.
On the night of April the 10th, 1948, Irgun soldiers surrounded the sleeping village of Deir Yassin near Jerusalem. What happened that night still fills Arabs with horror and a growing number of Jews with shame. Taken back to the scene after 35 years, the villagers remember.
اللي كانوا في سن ال20 و25 وهذا شو كانوا يعملوا؟ كانوا يبقروا بطونهم الفران وابنه انحرقوا في الفرن داخل الفرن في باب الدار وهي عامله خبز عامله ابنها
قتلوها، قتلوا عمتي وقتلوا عم الحاج وقتلوا ابنها محمد.
اجى اليهودي مسك شد والله في اوريك كيف هذا شد اليهودي صار يشد في الهادي يسحب في الهادي لما ما سحبش مسك الهادي وذبح فؤاد ذبحوا على بطن على صدر امه.
يعني النكيز لو منعوا اليهود ما صارش في بلدنا هيك كان ما طخونا
ولو بعدين
ربونا مثل اليتامى. مين المسؤول عن اللي بربي ولد؟ لما انت بتربي ولد وبيجي واحد بكتله انه المسؤول عنه.
The Haganah admitted that some 250 people had been massacred at Deir Yassin. The British did not intervene.
As far as I'm concerned, it did not come within the province of any of the conditions of which I laid down. But it was such a horrific thing that we felt that something ought to be done.
In the event, the British did nothing. The Haganah told Macmillan they were in charge of the village. For him, that was good enough.
So the priority then was to save British lives, but not Arab lives.
That's right. That's right.
As news of the massacre at Deir Yassin spread, the Palestinians began to flee in panic, some at gunpoint. Jewish forces stepped up their attacks on Arab villages and towns.
In many cases, they found themselves caught between, let's say, the devil and the deep blue sea, if you like. Since we blew up the installations or the houses within the villages, maybe they were terrorized by the terrorists, maybe they were not. I don't know. Then if they were afraid, and in some cases, and quite a number of them, they left the villages.
The Arabs were uprooted from their country by Jewish violence, or Zionist violence, you might like to call it. They didn't leave voluntarily. And if they had left voluntarily, they should have permitted them to go back. It was a plan to panic the Arabs and force them to leave the country. That's how they left.
In the end, more than 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed, driven from their homes by force or fear. Most found shelter in makeshift camps, which later became their permanent homes. Hundreds of villages, even towns, were to be left deserted. Under the noses of the British, the Zionists expanded their territory across 3/4 of Palestine. In desperation, the Palestinians looked to their neighbors. The Arab states had promised to defend Palestine. But whether for the Palestinians or for themselves had never been clear.
We decided to set up a shadow government for the whole of Palestine. So when the British withdraw, it will take over the country. We couldn't do it by ourselves. We had to obtain Arab support. The Arab states did not see our point of view. due to American and British influence.
The Arab armies were equipped by Britain. In an attempt to avert war, Bevin set up a deal with Abdullah, King of Jordan. When the British left Palestine, Abdullah's Arab Legion, under its British officers, could annex the Arab part, provided the Arab armies kept out of the Jewish part. The Zionist leaders were tipped off.
On one occasion, I was in the delegates' lounge of the United Nations, talking with Colonial Minister Creech Jones and Mr. Charette of the Zionist group. Just the three of us, and at one point, Mr. Creech Jones turned to Charette and said, "We know you're going to have your Arab state in Palestine, your Jewish state in Palestine. Of course, the Arab Legion would move, but it will move only into those areas assigned to the Arabs under the partition arrangement." Well, Charette, of course, took that as a statement of the greatest possible importance because the Arab Legion was the only effectively organized force in the Arab world, and it was under British command.
Despite the secret maneuvers of the British, their imminent departure now threatened to unleash war. Volunteers flocked to join the Arab armies as they gathered on the borders of Palestine. But their vast numbers gave a false impression.
We never had an army to fight with. Why did we get into this war? We had simply, the British didn't let us have an army. They let us have a few soldiers for receptions and for protocol and for drums and music, not for guns. So Britain is responsible for the weakness of the Arabs, but the Arabs themselves are to be blamed for lack of knowledge, lack of preparation, lack of unity. That's my view.
We were not going to help either side. I mean, we were, I think there became, perhaps a bit later, this agreement with the Americans that they would not arm the new state of Israel, in return for which we would stop our sending of arms to Arab countries.
On the 12th of May, 48, and I was still much younger than I am now, I was the head of the operations, I was summoned suddenly by Ben Gurion to an emergency meeting of the temporary government of Israel. It was on a Wednesday, and about 10 of the 13 members were sitting there, and Ben Gurion said to me, "We are about to decide to declare the state of Israel the moment the British will quit on the 15th. But members here would like to know from you, objectively as you can, without any expressing your own feelings whether a state should be declared or not, what are the chances of us defending this future state if the British will leave and the Arabs will invade the country?" I must say that this was the most difficult answer I ever had to give. And the gist of the answer was that I said that it is 50-50.
My feeling, and most of our feeling, was this: the Arabs were going to fight us whether we established a state or not. Therefore, why not establish it? Let them fight against us as a state and not fight against us as an anonymous community.
On May the 14th, 1948, the British High Commissioner took leave of Jerusalem for the last time. There was no United Nations authority to take his place. No one turned out to cheer or even boo as he left by the back streets for Haifa. The next day, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. Its gates would be open to the 100,000 and more, as long as they were Jewish.
The British said that it was their duty, because of their common and dual duty to protect both the Jewish and Arabs, to behave the way they did. We didn't think so, but the Arabs didn't think so either.
Did they have a grudge against the British? They did, and they still have it. We believe sincerely that the cause of our plight and the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine is the British.
We have been forced into this policy which we would not have chosen ourselves. But the policies we had wanted to follow had not been acceptable to other people, so we had washed our hands of it.
Palestine, the peaceful land the British took over, they turned into a battlefield. Their departure evoked worldwide contempt. The war that began as they left has not yet ended.
The hardback book, End of Empire, is available at all bookstores, including the ABC shop in your capital city. In a few moments, ABC News, then our simulcast of The Requiem by Verdi.